right. Settle down, everyone. It's great to hear so much conversation. That's the point of these days, is to prompt interesting conversation. I'm sure you were all talking about greenhouse gas removals already, which is excellent. Well done. My name's Alyssa. I've been involved in the Greenhouse Gas Removal Core project since it began. And it's really exciting to be here at this wider GGR event to talk about all of the things that we've learned, have yet to learn, have to implement, the challenging questions all around greenhouse gas removal, as well as the opportunity to see some stuff. So if you go outside while you're here, downstairs, upstairs, everywhere you go, you'll see greenhouse gas removal videos, samples, people who want to talk to you about it. So hopefully you came really interested in this subject. And by the time you go, you'll be really engaged and knowledgeable about the subject, which is really exciting. By the way, don't do what I did. I kind of mistook a bit of biochar for chocolate cake. Luckily, I didn't act on that. So I'm just here to welcome everyone to the day. So what we're going to do first is, not surprisingly, a bit of housekeeping. So if you can give Michael your attention, she's going to tell you some important practical pieces of information.
Thank you. So we've got Wi-Fi is on the screen. It's also in signs around the building. The toilets are downstairs at reception. No food and water, no food and drink in this room, but you can bring bottled water. And we are going to have catering on this floor and downstairs throughout the day. And then also the ground floor from lunch and the afternoon tea. So if you find there's a bit of a line, just go down into the basement. And there's stairs you can access for the stairs out of this room, or there's also an elevator in the hallway. In terms of fire safety, there are no tests or phased alarms. But if there is an alarm, everyone should leave by the nearest fire exit. Do not go downstairs to gather your belongings, just head straight out. All the fire exits are marked with the green running person. We all exit into the street front. You turn right and right again to gather by the Churchill sitting on the bench with somebody else. And also don't, if the alarm stops, just keep going, because it might just be a flaw, but just keep going. Please keep your badges if you are going to be here tomorrow. The badge colors they're color coded: red for staff, so if you have any questions, just find somebody with a red badge. Orange for speakers, that's to help us find you, to come and bring you to speak. And yellow for exhibitors, so we've got artists, we have project stalls, so we've got yellow for those people, and then everyone else is blue. Just to introduce you to the platform. Yeah. This is not working very well. So this is the CVent platform, and I hope everybody is downloading it, because we've got the schedule on there, and there's other things. You should have received an email with instructions. You just go to the Play Store and download CVent, and then you can find the event. The name is the UK GGR Event, and sign in. The schedule is on there. We've got parallels for the afternoon. Please select your parallel session so we know how many people are in the rooms. As well as the schedule, there's other info on the app. There's attendee lists, speakers, layout maps, so that you can find the location of the exhibits on the layout maps. And we will be using this for Q&A. So if you want to ask questions during the sessions, you have to use this app. There's some highlights. There's a survey. This is a biochar market survey. So there's a link to the survey there if you'd like to answer some questions. We'd be delighted if you would go on there and do that. And then there's exhibits. So there's the artists. You can find out more about the artists on the app, and the project stalls. And the Royal Institution will be doing a demonstration of the John Tyndall, the instruments John Tyndall used to demonstrate greenhouse gases. That will be on the lower ground floor at lunchtime. So you could go downstairs, get your lunch, and go and check out the instruments. So somebody from the RI archive will be showing us what's happening. And there will also be a video screening in the theater during breaks. One of our artists will be in here. So please do circulate and see. Oh, and there's one other thing. There will be a game on the app, which I think is launching soon, and that will help you also look around, find things throughout the building. And I'll just pass to Colin.
Hi, I'm Helen Bunting. I'm the Communications Manager at the Core Hub. And we are on social media. Exciting. If you would like to post on social media about the event, which we really encourage you to do, your reflections, photos, videos, whatever you'd like to post, please remember to tag us on LinkedIn. We are Core, the Greenhouse Gas Removal Hub. We're also on Blue Sky and Instagram. And afterwards, we'll be posting videos on our YouTube channel. So please do follow us there as well. And yes, we also have a photographer who will be here throughout the day taking photos. If you don't wish to be photographed, let's see, or if you don't wish your image to be in social media, could you please email us at the core email address above? Thank you.
Okay, great. So now to get on to the meat of the session, it's my great pleasure to introduce Helen Chertsky, who's going to be the compere for the rest of the day. Helen said I should be brief, but it's good for you to know something about her and why we've invited her, and she's kindly accepted to be the compere for today. She's a physicist and an oceanographer, a presenter and an author. She's an associate professor at UCL, where she works on breaking waves and bubbles at the ocean surface. And you might recognize her from some BBC documentaries. If you don't, you can look her up afterwards on the Fully Charged Show and the Cosmic Shambles Network. I think what is really significant to me about Helen is that she's someone who really is a leading edge researcher, but someone who also clearly, with evidence, works at the boundary between talking to people about the technical areas of science she's working on and engaging with tricky and knotty and difficult problems. She's got opinions and she's willing to dive into these issues, which is really, really great. And I think she's going to help make today really lively and engaging. She has been on the stage before because she was Royal Institution Christmas lecturer in 2020, entitled The Water World. So once you're a Helen fan, which you will be after today, you can look up all of these other things. But with great pleasure, I invite Helen to take the stage and take us forward for today. Thanks, Helen.
Thank you, Alyssa. So I'm going to stand here to speak just briefly before we get started. And there's a reason for that, is that you are standing in a historic lecture theatre. The Royal Institution has been connecting science to society for 200 years. Almost every topic you can think of, almost every famous scientist in the UK that you can think of has spoken on this stage. And the reason I'm standing here is that I would like you to appreciate what this environment is like. The very steep slopes here put me right in the middle. Not because of me, but because it makes you look across at each other. It brings you into the conversation. This is a room which doesn't have barriers. And it's a really wonderful place. It's obviously got, as Alyssa said, an amazing history of communicating, of connecting science to the public. But I think it's very important that the feel of this room is the feel of these discussions. We are all in it together. That's what this space does to us. And so as you go through the day, appreciate what there is something special about this space. I've never spoken anywhere else quite like this. So I think each of us has 3 life support systems. We've got our own body, we've got planet Earth, and we've got the infrastructure of our civilization. And of course, the existential threat that we face at the moment is that 2 of those life support systems have come into conflict with each other, our planetary life support system and the infrastructure of our civilization. Now, the planet is very large and very intricate and very complex, and it's got its own rules. Our civilization is much newer, and so it's our civilization really that's going to change, because our planet more or less is not going to. So this is the boundary that we have to navigate. And we are now aware enough of what we're doing, of what our infrastructure is doing, that we have responsibility, of course. So I'm sure you all know the wider context. Greenhouse gases reached a new high in 2024. There are signs that there's a plateau, but a plateau is not enough. We need reductions. And in the UK, there is a bit more of a positive story. Our emissions within our borders dropped by 3.6% in 2024, which they're now half of what they were in 1990. This is all brilliant, but it's not enough. We need to go further and faster on emissions reduction in order to reach the targets for keeping our our planetary life support system in a reasonable state. But of course, it's not enough to stop putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. That is a very urgent and drastic priority. We also have to consider taking them out. And so the term for this, as you all know, is net zero, and every scenario that predicts us being able to stay underneath 2 degrees C of warming requires removal of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, but we don't currently have scalable ways to make that happen. We need to do the work to see what's possible, and of course, that's why we're all here, is to talk about what may or may not be possible. So what counts when it comes to removing carbon? I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this, but let's just do a little bit of the basics. So we're not here today to talk about the natural sinks of carbon. They already take up around half of all the additional greenhouse gases we put into the atmosphere. But, you know, the planet is dealing with that. That's not our topic for today. It's also not carbon capture and storage, which is CCS, which is the word for collecting carbon at the point of emission from a fossil fuel source and then putting it somewhere. So we're not here to talk about that. But we are here to talk about the sort of removal that comes about because of a human intervention or invention. Something that takes carbon from the atmosphere, carbon that would not otherwise have been taken up from the atmosphere, that's important. And it also has to keep it stored. And those are the two things that matter. It's got to be additional and it's got to be durable. So all of this sounds, promising, but thinking about these things is important. This is a serious task. None of it removes the need to focus on stopping emissions, but in parallel to that huge change, we have to think about how carbon removal systems might work, not just would they work. So there are some big questions, and they're not all technical. So what would they need? What would a scheme need in order to work? The first thing is it has to actually work. It has to actually take up carbon. It has to be demonstrated. You have to be accountable. It has to be open. These systems have to earn the trust of society, of landowners and other stakeholders, of the public. And of course, the systems need to be designed in collaboration. So we need regulations and standards. We need to do this in a way that doesn't cause other problems. It's no good going down a chain of problems, do one thing and it causes another one. So we should have predictive systems that are good enough to avoid unintended harmful consequences and to acknowledge the trade-offs. There are always going to be trade-offs. They need to be acknowledged openly. And of course, it needs to be something that can be scaled up, can make a significant difference. It needs to have a funding mechanism. It needs to have supply chains and trained personnel. These are big tasks, right? This is a big ask. But humans like a challenge. We're all in for that. And of course, the foundation for answering any of these questions, for designing these systems, is that we need to do research. We need to do robust, evidence-based research. It needs to be open. It needs to be transparent. It needs to be shared. We need to learn together what will and won't work. And we need to listen to the public, not just tell them what to do. So that's why this is a nice environment to be in, because this is a two-way process. So the UK has provided significant leadership in this effort. So the project that frames today's discussions, the GGRD programme, which is Greenhouse Gas Removal Demonstrators programme, is made up of two things. It's made up of the core hub, which is, and then the 5 demonstrator projects. So that will make more sense to you in a minute because we're going to hear from people representing each of those 6 strands. It was funded by UKRI as a 5-year project. It cost £32 million, and it's coming to the end of those 5 years. And importantly, it's not just about the technical science. There are also social science questions, a lot of discussion with the potential stakeholders and potential users. This is an integrated and holistic project. So the point of today is to use this project and the results and the learning that has come from it as a stimulus for debate. What's been learned, which doors have been opened and closed, and what ideas have come out of it, and what are the plans for what happens next. So the way this is going to work is that in this first session, you will get an introduction to each of those 6 strands. The lead from each one will come up, introduce themselves. They'll speak for a few minutes each. And after that, we will have a discussion down here on the stage. And all of that, which is quite a lot, will take us up to the tea break. But you do get to join in. So as you just saw, there's this app, the Cvent app. And if you go to the session, this session, and you scroll all the way down the session, at the bottom, there is a Q&A section, Q&A little thing. Now, throughout this session and throughout the rest of the day, you can put your questions and your comments and your criticisms and whatever else you want to share with everybody, put it in there. There will be Q&A sections for all the other sessions, but they are separate. They're all going to close when their session closes. This one, for the first session, is going to stay open all day, and that's your kind of repository for your thoughts and questions and comments. So you can put them in there at any point, and then in the fourth plenary this afternoon, towards the end of the afternoon, there will be a session where all of those will be, we may not be able to answer every single one of them, but those concerns will be aired, and the team will certainly pay attention to what the questions were. So do put everything you've got into that. And so now it is time for me to introduce you to the first of the 6 leads we're going to hear from today. 5 of them are here in person. The 6th one sadly got delayed got stuck with trains, which is very sad. If you're trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and someone's trying to travel by train and the trains stop them, that feels very unfair. But anyway, so he will be joining us online towards the end. But let's get started. So the first PI, that your principal investigator that you'll be hearing from, is Professor Colin Snape, who's the PI of the Biochar Demonstrator, and he's based at the University of Nottingham. Colin, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, good morning, everybody. I start off this talk with a mention of Harry Potter. All I'm going to say is that I predate the first Harry Potter in 1998. I've been a chair since 1995, and I've been at Nottingham since 2000. So, yeah, my brief today is to give you an overview of biochar, its potential, and really what we've been looking at, what might stop biochar making a significant contribution to the 2050 target for GGR. So this is a program in a nutshell. We're looking right across the chain from feedstock availability through to production, the actual composition of a biochar, going on into extensive field trials, and headline figure is we can claim this is the largest integrated trial in the UK, over 2,000 tonnes deployed across a whole series of arable grassland and forestry trials, and we're looking at agronomic ecoservice impacts, and really to identify the agricultural core benefits of biochar as a soil improver. That then naturally leads into the techno-economic life cycle analysis, and most importantly, stakeholder engagement, because I think this summary will indicate, as with many technologies, if there are significant stakeholder objections, then it ain't going to happen. So in terms of feedstock mapping for mass deployment of biochar, we've really looked at what you might call low-cost feedstocks, which are available in significant quantities. And what we've done is taking what is the maximum potential and really just rounded that down to what is actually realizable. So in terms of these, what you might call additional feedstocks, yeah, we can certainly get up to the order of 5 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent. And just to pick one of the feedstocks we've looked at, which is straw, what we've done is taken the surplus which is available, looked at its geographical distribution, and from that we can identify optimum locations for production. And yeah, in this case, we will be getting to the order of 1.3 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent. Yeah, this is something which fascinates literally everybody. We put biochar in the ground. How long is it going to last? And I think we do have really a conflict between geologists and biosciences, where geologists are quite happy to things survive in millions of years, and biosciences get uncomfortable if anything survives more than about 100 years. So yeah, this is important because certainly voluntary carbon markets are all using their measures of stability, and that really governs how much you get through carbon trading. So yeah, this is a method we've developed at Nottingham, and the slide just shows you what we consider to be very labile, easily degradable parts of biochar, and all these hexagons, which we take as being the stable fraction. So yeah, our method measures what is the stable fraction, which is unlikely to degrade over timescales of tens of thousands of years. We've worked extensively with the European Biochar certificate, and we're pleased to say our method has been accepted and should be included in the EBC standard shortly in terms of measures to assess stability. And this is just one example of a plot showing our parameter. Conductivity is very, very easy to measure. There are a number of things which affect it, but what you can say, if you've got a conductivity above a certain level, you can pretty much assure you've got a very, very stable biochar. Right, briefly onto the economics life cycle analysis, and the plot on the left-hand side really summarizes the situation. This is really total production costs, capital operating costs, and these work out broadly £200 per tonne of CO2 equivalent. There are potentially some very, very easy gains. We've had a project on digestate from food waste, which contains copious quantities of plastic, which all has to go to incineration. So biochar actually stands up without any carbon trading. But clearly, if you're not getting a gate fee, I think it's fair to say there is a bit of a shortfall between the income you get from carbon trading, even if you've got a dry feedstock income you'll get from heat export. And so effectively the biochar needs to attract value in some way. So potentially it goes through some, what I can broadly call environmental duty. Then after that, yeah, it can be buried in the ground. So net sequestration potential, and this is just a summary of all the life cycle analysis we've done. And you can say what's above the line is very, very small compared to what is below the line. And I think the watchword is for waste. Just avoid transportation, because clearly if you start transporting low density materials over large distances, then your carbon footprint as well as the economics suffers. Right, so summarizing all our field trials, which in its entirety has covered 10 arable farms, forestry, worked very closely with National Forest, grassland sites based at Bangor, and large-scale composting windrow trials. And what we've wanted to do is really set what is a sensible, safe maximum limit on the amount of biochar you can deploy. So that's why I went to 10 tonnes per hectare, which was just a one-off application. And essentially, to summarize, we've seen no detrimental soil health effects. On smaller plots, we've gone to 20 tonnes per hectare, and again, no detrimental effects. I should say, you might think 10 tonnes per hectare is a hell of a lot of biochar, but in terms of the soil mass, it's only about halfway percent if a biochar does get mixed into a depth of about 20 centimetres. So big thing we've seen, and luckily we've had a drought this year, and we had a really bad drought the first year of our programme, is many specific site improvements from moisture retention. Yeah, this image just shows an example of yield and leaf area index. Yeah, biodiversity, yeah, certainly what we've done on earthworms, no effects. And I think many of us know that biochar can moderate the release of other greenhouse gas emissions. It potentially reduces runoff. So if you keep your nutrients where you want them to be, then clearly there is a potential for reduced fertilizer. And yeah, so from composting, advantage of putting biochar in, before composting is we do observe significant CO2 emissions. I mean, yeah, you're all seen in your local garden centres. There are a number of vendors selling mixtures of compost and biochar. Grassland, once we're out of the food chain, yeah, we can potentially go to higher levels. So trials at Bangor, 50 tonnes per hectare. This is a legacy historic trial, been in the ground 13 years. No ill effects, and the situation is similar for forestry. Right, what I think is very important is stakeholder engagement, and just to mention, both are in the audience, Catherine Smart and Carol Wallace, who formulated this in terms of extensive exercise. So all I want to do is focus in on the farmers, because as you imagine, for arable land deployment, if the farmers aren't happy, it ain't going to happen. So yeah, generally interviews showed farmers are interested and enthusiastic about biochar trials, and in fact a number of farmers have come to us to set up trials. So they're not so much interested in the carbon storage side of things as you might imagine. You know, their focus is on improving soil health. Does it improve production? And other applications, can we reduce ammonia emissions from livestock and poultry? So, you know, there are potentially multiple benefits, and I think, you know, clearly farmers suffer from the way in the voluntary carbon market, carbon credits are spread out. It all goes to the producer. Nothing goes to the end deployer of the biochar, in this case, the farmers. So I think, because I'm up first, I can mention this, and you'll hear plenty of this later on today in terms of co-application of different GGR approaches, or I think stacking is a new term, which is often used. And yeah, just to cut a long story short, all our co-applications of biochar, we haven't as yet seen any cause for concern, and the other demonstrators will indicate some of the beneficial effects that are being obtained. Yep. And finally, just to finish on in terms of skills and training, we're only 4 years into the programme. High turnover of staff, but that is really, really positive, because the 4 individuals on this slide are all in the audience, and each of them have got positions related to GGR and biochar. Thank you.
Shall I take the clicker from you?
Yeah, all right.
Okay, next. So and next we're going to hear from Professor Chris Evans, who's the Principal Investigator of the GGR Peat Demonstrator from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. You're over there.
Brilliant, thank you. So I was told I had 3 slides. Guess no one told Colin. So I've got 4. But the first one's a title slide, if I can. There we go. So that's my first slide. So this is one of our demonstrators. So given that I didn't think I had very many slides, I've probably got over-ambitious on the animations with this one, so we'll see if this goes well or badly. And the reason I've done this is because when we say we're doing a peat GGR project, people often say, why peat? Isn't that the problem? Why, how do you use it for carbon capture? Because it is a problem. So I'll try and talk through this if my animations work. So I think we're doing peat in a sense because someone needed to look at soil carbon sequestration, and we managed to make the case with this project that while you can store a lot of carbon into soils, there's a limit for most soils. Mineral soils can take so much carbon and then they can't really take any more. And if you keep pushing it in, you have to keep pushing it in because it will start coming out again. So although there's much to do with a lot of our carbon depleted soils, basically peat, there's a lot more carbon in there. It's our richest carbon store in the terrestrial ecosystem, both in the UK and globally. And so that gives us an opportunity because there's a lot of carbon storage there that, potentially about as much as you could put into geological storage or similar order. But right now it isn't part of the solution, it's part of the problem. And there's people in this room whose problem this is at DEFRA. Because a lot of our peatlands in the UK and globally have been drained, mostly for agriculture, so the water table's down, and the reason peat accumulates is because it's wet, it can't decompose, so it piles up over thousands of years and sticks around. But if you drain it, it can start to go really fast through aerobic decomposition. So this is, I think, my only real graph. It is data-based despite appearances, but basically what it's showing is that there's this relationship between drainage depth, so that's going left to right, and the greenhouse gas balance of the system. So as you drain the system, you get more CO2 coming out, so you end up, I won't point because I'll be pointing the wrong way, but you end up where that black circle is. So that's a fairly typical emission rate for a drained cropland on peat in the UK, and it's a lot. It's a significant fraction of our total greenhouse gas emissions. So we kind of know that we can stop that through re-wetting, and that sounds easy. It's not easy. It's actually taking quite a lot of work and working with farmers and others to try to come up with ways that we can do this within farming systems, or at least reduce the problem we've got. But we kind of know that if we get that right, where we get that right, we can bring the greenhouse gas balance down to about zero. And the reason it's zero is because you get carbon CO2 accumulation into the peat, but because it's wet, you also get methane production. So that red line you can see starts to go up when it gets really wet. So that's where we're sort of at with the restoration work, and that's part of the carbon budgets. It's part of the UK's strategy for addressing climate change is to bring that down to zero. But the idea of this project is to think, well, if we're doing that anyway, you know, could we actually turn the dial the other direction? So it's, you know, if we could do that, that would be great. So we can get sort of natural carbon accumulation rates, but can we actually do a bit more than that? So in order to do that, there's several things we need to do. The first is to stop that red line going up, so to try to reduce the amount of methane you get when you re-wet a system, and that would bring us to that first green dot. The second thing we're thinking about doing, and we're trying to do in the demonstrators, is to increase that rate of carbon input. So for example, we're growing biomass crops, so you'll hear more about those in a bit, to try to increase the primary productivity of the system to get more carbon that can then go in. And I'll say a bit more about the demonstrator sites in a minute. The second thing we're looking at, you just heard about, is turning that biomass into biochar, because that's more stable. And if we can do that and put that back into the system, and I should have said, raise the water table being number one, this won't work unless you do that. So that's the concept anyway. It requires a mixed model. About 12-13%, I think, of the UK is peat. It's in very mixed conditions. Some of it's intensively farmed in the lowlands, some of it's still quite natural or semi-natural in the uplands. It's got high landscape value. You know, it's got cultural value. It's not something you'd want to put a miscanthus farm on necessarily. So we need to sort of work within a sort of natural system in those areas. So we're looking at different models. So this is the what did we do slide. This is 4 demonstrator sites. So the top 2 are lowland sites. The bottom 2 are in the uplands. So just to skim around them, so the Lapwing site, that's up near Doncaster. It's working with a farm partner who've also got their own GGR stuff going on through a project called Reverse Coal. And there we're looking at, this is a form of, well, it's an actively farmed landscape. There's broccolis just over the other side of the, you know, the next field. So we've looked at growing both sort of classic biomass crops and also wetland biomass crops, so reed and bulrush, as you can see. And that was at the plot scale, and now we've got a field trial with willow ongoing, but a lot of challenges bringing the water table up there because of this issue around sort of managing within a farm landscape. So we set up the second site, which is the one at the top right, and what you can see there is essentially one field that's now got 2 internal moats, and those 2 areas are hydrologically sealed. There's pumps bringing water in, so we can essentially hold the water level exactly where we want it within these trial areas. And there we're growing miscanthus. It looks a bit sad because that was midwinter when the drone went up, but actually it's looking really good now. It's growing like crazy. And adjacent to that, in coordination with another couple of projects, one called NetZeroPlus, there's a series of sort of small plot trials, and that's looking at both biomass crops, commercial food crops, and yeah, if you saw the BBC News on Sunday, you might have seen the rice trials. They were a bit of fun, but it worked, or at least it worked this year because it was hot and sunny, so the rice seems to have ripened. I'm not sure that's the whole solution, but this is the first time anyone's been daft enough to try it, and it did work. And then the two upland sites, sorry. So the one on the bottom left is an active grouse moor. It's dominated by heather in the Peak District. That dominance of heather is not natural, and it sort of dries out the peat, and it leads to things like erosion and fire risk. So there we're looking at trying to sort of re-wet it, and then, as I said, sort of work with nature through mowing off that heather, planting in sphagnum, doing other things around trying to suppress the methane, using gypsum actually, as well as biochar. So not going crazy with that system. And similarly at the bottom right side, that's Perennial, which is in Mid Wales. Similar concept there. So taking a site that's actually, as it turns out, not so degraded, but trying to sort of speed up that recovery process and augment the carbon input. So that's what we're up to. And all of these sites act as a sort of foundation, I suppose, for all of the work we're doing around it with farmers and other stakeholders in those areas. And I'm not going to say too much about that in my 3 slides. But what did we find? So a few things to skim through as best I can. Firstly, we actually found that the miscanthus really grows like hell on these soils, as do many things, and that's why it's valuable farmland, it should be said. But there's enough biomass going into the miscanthus, we think, if you turn it into biochar to already offset the ongoing emissions from the peat. But that's not really what we want. We want to stop those emissions. So we think if we did those 2 things together, although we're still measuring this, so this is a slightly made up number at 2 decimal places, we think we could get some quite serious GGR, and we don't think the methane emissions are anywhere near enough to offset that. In fact, we're sure they're not. So it's quite positive. Where we've put biochar on an experimental sort of plots or mesocosm scale, we're finding that it's actually pretty good at suppressing all of the greenhouse gases. So it's slowing the decomposition of the peat. It's definitely reducing methane production, and sometimes it's reducing nitrous oxide production as well. In the uplands, it's a slightly different story. It's a sort of more subtle story, so it's smaller changes, but very, very large areas. And a lot of, as I said, a lot of this stuff's happening anyway. A lot of these restoration measures are happening. So we think just by tweaking the dial a little bit over that very large land area, that could start to add up to a very significant mitigation. And we're running out of time. I'll talk too long for my few slides. So yeah, we've got a lot of peat. It's aligned with Carbon Budget 7 and all the other carbon budgets. And that's a pretty hokey attempt to scale up what would happen if we implemented the 6th carbon budget with additional carbon sequestration and reduced methane into peat. And already with a fairly conservative estimate, we're up to quite a few megatons. So that's me. Thank you.
I'll put that back.
Happy to do that.
Next, we're going to hear from Professor Iain Donnison, who's the PI, this name, honestly. Scientists, sort out your acronyms. He's the PI of the PBC4GGR Demonstrator, for anyone who's a keen Scrabble player, which stands for the Perennial Biomass Crops for Greenhouse Gas Removal, and he's from the University of Aberystwyth. Here you go. Thanks, Iain.
Right. Thanks very much. So, thanks for the introduction. Morning, everyone. Perennial Biomass Crops for Greenhouse Gas Removal. So, this project was one that brought ourselves I was at Aberystwyth University and Rothamsted Research, so agricultural scientists together with colleagues at the Centre of Ecology and Hydrology, and in terms of the environmental sciences, and also in terms of the social sciences at the Countryside and Communities Research Institute at the University of Gloucester, and then the engineering and how we link this with CCS. With engineers and modelers at the University of Aberdeen. So I guess bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, so BECCS, is really working on a very large natural process, photosynthesis, that plants already do. Bioenergy has been around for pretty much as long as civilization in terms of the way that we've used biomass for heat and then motive transport and so on, when we were growing crops like oats to feed draft animals. More recently, there has been an interest in a range of renewables in terms of how we use biomass for heat and power. But really what BECCS does is actually combine that very fast growth, and rather than use biomass as storage and shorter term storage as we're hearing in sort of biological terms, with combining that with geological storage. So we're using typically very fast growing plants. So really the two crops in the UK that mainly get looked at is miscanthus, a very fast growing tropical grass, and also short rotation coppice willow. So miscanthus will grow about 4 meters in a year. Willow will be, and harvested annually. Willow tends to be harvested every 3rd year. So both of these very fast growing. So the key bit is we're keeping these plants in this very fast growing stage rather than starting to plateau out later. But putting on the back end of that, capturing that CO2 at power stations or however that biomass is going to be used, and then doing the geological storage on it. So I guess the key bit here really is when we start looking at things like the carbon budget 7 from Climate Change Committee and others, in terms of the need for various sort of technologies to get these negative emissions. So BECCS, in terms of either for power, energy from waste, and other ways that we can do that, possibly from making cement and so on, we can capture these, are really going to be important as we start bringing in other technologies like DACs. And I think one of the things that's really important here is that actually, so biomass and CCS makes a lot of sense. Now we're basically repurposing CCS from the oil and gas industry. CCS is going to be really critical for DACs later on this century. And by then we may be actually putting that biomass maybe into sustainable aviation fuels, green steel, construction materials, chemicals, and so on. So basically these technologies make a lot of sense to bring together now in terms of particularly meeting these targets for the middle of the century. So in terms of the project, what have we been doing? So a lot of this is really that, again, that demonstration model of actually how do we take what we know now, so a range of where are we at with current best practice. So particularly here, which tends to typically be when we're planting these crops in terms of ploughing and applying herbicide during the establishment phase, not once the crops are established, but basically getting these young plants established. Can we minimize or can we reduce that ploughing, and can we also reduce those initial chemical inputs? And so we've been looking at a range of different approaches for doing that. Basically sort of summarizing that, we've been quite successful if we're going into arable systems, but it becomes much more challenging in grassland systems where the weed burden is a lot higher in those early stages. So sort of mixed bits there, but basically current best practice works, but we can do some other ways to reduce those inputs. Another important piece is actually during those establishment phases, really looking at what's happening in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So looking at whole fields, using eddy flux towers, but also using sort of smaller sort of measuring at on the field as well while we're doing these establishments. So the whole field here, this is the picture here behind of a 10-hectare site. We did a 10-hectare site of miscanthus, 10-hectare site of willow, 2 different locations in the UK. We had this set up. So the miscanthus one on the drier east, willow on the wetter west. And what we were doing here is establishing these for measuring the fluxes. But also here with miscanthus, we were using for the first time at scale planting the miscanthus from basically from seed via modules rather than the rhizome planting. And a big reason for this is if we really want to scale up, and we have about 10,000 hectares of these crops at the moment in the UK, we really will need things like seed multiplication sort of steps to really ramp that up. So we're using technology that already exists. The modules will actually fit with things like planting robots and so on. So actually this could be scaled up quite rapidly. So we've got that to a new variety that's now seed-based, and also we can do at scale. Importantly, so colleagues at Countryside and Research, Countryside Communities Research Institute, working with farmers, what are the barriers to adoption? Why aren't more people growing these crops now? In terms of understanding, you know, how do we sort of in effect normalize these crops? What's missing in terms of this sort of advice? What's missing from some of these sort of economics in terms of why would you, the challenge of planting crops that are probably going to be in the ground 15, 20, maybe plus years, compared to actually planting annual or short-lived perennial crops where you've got more certainty in terms of what that sort of funding looks like. So large amount of policy interaction there in terms of determining which crops get grown. And then in terms of on the modelling side of actually taking, well, you know, basically these are the sort of vegetation models, these are the yields we're seeing, what's happening in terms of the emissions and also what's happening in terms of utilisation. So we can sort of feed those through. So in terms of what does this actually mean, in terms of if we were going to do this in the UK and we take things like the Climate Change Committee's recommendations, let's say of about 700,000 hectares of these sort of crops grown in the UK, there's probably about 130,000 hectares of crops being grown for biomass or for energy. We look at things like AD or things like oilseed rape that's going into biodiesel and so on. But if we take that 700,000 of these sort of crops, that area in the red there, so roughly the size of Cumbria, so this is actually put on the map that was developed for the National Food Strategy. Basically, how do we use land in the sort of 21 million hectares of the UK? Where does that sort of all fit in? So in effect, you know, that is sort of in terms of all those other uses we have, how would that in theory fit in? Of course, as we've been hearing already, and there's probably a big message from the demonstrators, is we can actually stack some of these GGR approaches. So again, one of the treatments that we were looking at in the agronomy was actually incorporating biochar in the planting there, so the ability to stack multiple ones. And then another sort of piece here really of sort of looking in terms of actually that sort of loss or gain. So this was a paper we put together where we sort of brought together all the data that existed, particularly to try and help policymakers with where are we at in terms of what we know. But really some of the sort of real valuable bits that we're seeing at the moment in terms of where we can make really significant interventions, where we've got basically degraded soils, we've got areas that are particularly prone to drought, particularly prone to flooding, and particularly where we've got persistent weed problems. So we can make some very specific interventions, and those tend to be the areas that farmers are growing these at the moment. Obviously, the opportunity is then to push that further out. And I'll finish there.
Thank you very much. Okay. Next up is Iain Bateman, who's the PI of the NetZeroPlus demonstrator, and he's from the University of Exeter.
Thank you very much. So I want to very quickly overview the entire project, but also finish with some impact results that are coming out. As you'd expect, we looked in detail at the GGR technology that we were focusing on, forestry. We looked at it in terms of what happens when you plant different trees in different places, how they grow over time, how they interact with the soils, how tree management can have an enormous impact on the consequences of this, and even what happens post-felling to the carbon that's stored there. But equally important was for us to look at the wider picture, because when you change land use in a substantial way, as all of the GGRs are really hypothesizing, you will have lots of other effects as well. And if you don't bring those effects into the analysis, then quite frankly, you don't know what the consequence of your project is. And I actually think this goes to the heart of the problem of decision making, not just in this country, but around the world. We tend to focus as if wider effects just don't actually exist. So we have attempted to understand and quantify and model all of the interactions that you can see on that diagram. If I simplify it, you can see there was a variety of models that we developed, often building on prior research. and combining them in a variety of ways that actually meant that you didn't propagate errors through this system. There's a few things there that I just want to emphasize. You won't be surprised to see the GGR aspect of it, but looking at things like the impact that will have on biodiversity, on water quality, and of course a very major one on food. How when we change land use in such a major way, we are inevitably going to affect food production as well. Sometimes with some GGRs positively, often with planting trees, it will be negative. It will actually reduce the amount of food being produced. And so an important extra element to look at is the offshoring effect of this. Now, actually, that was very clearly demonstrated in Iain's slides. The offshoring effect of how we use our land is truly enormous. And if we don't allow for that and come up with the net GGR, then we will actually be making decisions on incorrect information. We wanted to go further than that. We wanted to provide decision makers with tools which would allow them to make decisions, not just come to us or consultants or wherever and ask questions. To do this, we had to tackle some quite fundamental problems with the speed at which a lot of these models operate. So in particular, we've got what's called process models in the middle of these. They're amazing in terms of their degree of comprehension of the multiple effects of land use change, but they are very slow. And they also require, a very high degree of expertise to use them. So what we wanted to do was to actually create something which could work extremely fast and which could be operated by people who didn't happen to have a PhD in programming. Real decision makers, in effect. And we worked very closely with a wide set of partners, but in particular the ones that you can see up there. So these are partners from the public sector, the private sector, and the third sector. And together, we co-designed tools which allow decision makers to, for example, select the things that they're interested in, the outcomes that they want. So it's not just that these tools allow a decision maker to say, well, what will happen if I do this? They also answer actually a much more sophisticated question. I want to get this outcome. What do I do? These tools are very high resolution, work across the country at micro scale, right the way down to field level, and they'll tell you what the consequences are of your changes or what you have to do to get the outcomes that you need across time and across space. These have allowed us to come up with a number of useful results. We can't show you some of those results because it's actually part of ongoing impact work with government. So these are not the actual maps that come out of this, but they are similar to what you would expect. What is very clear is that if you carry on the way that we're going, not just in terms of the objectives we've got, but the way we're implementing policy, we will end up with very, very different and suboptimal land use change across the country. One of many consequences of that is that we will not hit net zero if we carry on with current policies and the way we implement those policies. But we can hit net zero if we change. If we use the information that has been gathered over many, many years and of course refined under the GGRD policy, then we can actually hit net zero. We can hit it in ways also that generate enormous co-benefits. At least double what you would get from existing policies which don't hit those key GGR targets. want to finish, hopefully on time or even before, by thanking everybody that has been involved in this project. It's involved a lot of different institutions, and as you can see, a huge number of people. And the collaboration has been truly inspiring throughout that. So thank you all very much.
Brilliant, great. Thank you. Brilliant, good job. Okay, and now we're going to hear from Dr. Steve Smith, who is the Executive Director of the Core Hub, and he's based at the University of Oxford.
Thank you very much. Morning, everyone. So yeah, Core, a slightly different project within the programme. All the other ones are demonstrations of specific technologies, but we were really a research and engagement hub led out of 7 universities, looking across greenhouse gas removal in the round, so looking at the methods that were being explored by the demonstrators, but also looking at the wider range of methods, and really doing incredibly multidisciplinary, cross-cutting research and engagement, so looking across a range of disciplines that I'll touch on in the next few minutes. So led by the University of Oxford, but also including researchers at universities of Bristol, of Manchester, Leeds, Edinburgh, UCL and Imperial College in London as well. And it's been, as Iain said, so with Core, one of the most fun and engaging and solutions-focused projects I've ever been involved in. So thank you to all the team that's been involved. We set ourselves 3 overarching aims in Core. One was to ask, well, how do you define what a good removal technology is? And how do we support the ones that look good to scale faster? That's kind of the supply side. Can we make sure we've got a supply of removal options? But then also, how do we create the demand? And that's really about the role for policy. So can we identify the different policies that the UK government and other governments might be able to use to scale these things well? And can we actually analyze those policies for their strengths and benefits and opportunities and weaknesses? And then thirdly, but not least, it was about enhancing the UK's capacity to do greenhouse gas removal within the objective of meeting its net zero target and its wider targets. And that's about building a research and innovation community, which has been a big part of the last 5 years. But it's about also making sure that decision makers have the right tools to make the right decisions and a bunch of other things as well. So I'm just going to give you a flavor of a few things under each of these 3 headings to give you a sense of what we've been doing. So first on the assessing technologies. A really, really big question is, well, how are we defining good? And as a few of us have touched on, this is about the sort of narrow technological performance of an option. So how much greenhouse gas can it remove? What are the emissions involved over the life cycle of doing that? How additional and how durable is the storage? But it's about a bunch of other things. And one thing that we invested a lot of time and effort in as Core at the start was engaging with a very wide range of stakeholders. I can see many of you in the room here, and there were many others as well, to really work out what is it that is relevant to decision making. And we've come up with these 7 dimensions, right? So it's that technical performance, but it's also how do these things interact with the natural environment? What are the social factors? How able are we to monitor, report, and verify these methods, that the removal is actually happening, but also that we can monitor, report, and verify those wider environmental impacts? It's how do these things fit with the regulatory environment we have? And it's also, can these things make money? Or more broadly, how can someone who wants to do removals make a living out of doing this? Because that's going to be crucial to whether they're viable or not. So we did a lot of work pulling together all the different strands of expertise. We've got legal, social, environmental, economic in the hub more broadly. And we've created a set of indicators under each of these in the guide, which is available on the website, and we hope is a really useful tool for decision makers, for entrepreneurs and so on, to think holistically about what do we mean by good removals. A second thing we did is try to expand the palette of options, because you'll hear about 5 key, very promising removal methods today, but there is a wider set out there. And one of the unusual things about Core was we got, UKRI kindly allowed us to re-grant some money, and we spent some of that on supporting very early stage innovations, because we found that a lot of people have very good conceptual ideas actually for how removal could be done, but they struggle to get a bit of money just to try it out, do a proof of concept at the bench scale or the lab scale. And we funded 13 what we call Pathfinder projects just to run for a few months to test them out. And we've seen such methods come forward as solar-powered membranes, which can catalyze methane, so destroying ambient methane, getting rid of that from the atmosphere. We've also had methods which link to some of the demonstrators, so trying enhanced rock weathering actually in seagrass meadows in coastal regions, for instance. And actually, they've done pretty well. There are 5 patents that have come out of those. There's been, I think, over 200,000 additional funding that they've been able to move into. Some of the projects have done really well, winning prizes, for instance, from the Bezos Earth Fund, which is one of the global innovation competitions to be backed by a tech billionaire. And one of them has actually been an honourable failure. It's been tried and it's been proven to not work. But failing fast, I think, is part of good progress here. I'm just going to move on to talk actually about policy options, which was the second one. So we've analysed what are the different interventions that governments could put in place to stimulate demand and actually make that viable business model that I talked about. And we've identified at least 9 different policy options which could be used. These are things such as, you might know in the US, they've got a storage tax credit called the 45Q. So tax credits is one method. Another option is actually you could create an obligation on a set of responsible companies that are either emitting or generating fossil fuels, that a certain fraction of their emissions or carbon equivalent needs to be offset by removals, and that fraction could increase over time. That's what some people call a carbon take-back obligation. And we've analysed these methods as if we were sort of a treasury or a World Bank to say, well, how might these look to different policymakers and how effective they might they be? But while we've been doing that, of course, the government has been developing its own thinking and has actually picked 2 particular routes. One is a carbon contract for difference. Essentially, that's a guaranteed carbon price for BECCS and DACCS in particular. And then they've said that in the long run, they want to include these things in the emissions trading system that we have in the UK. So those are options we've looked at. And it's important to say there's no one policy mechanism we found which is the kind of absolute winner. They all have strengths and weaknesses. That particular set looks fairly good in terms of economic efficiency, certainly in terms of the public purse. It's a fairly good strategic fit to policies we already have and know and work well in this country. But there are other risks to it as well. We've actually done some quantitative analysis to look at, under a range of future uncertainties, how much might those policy mechanisms stimulate removals? And it looks like in some futures they might not stimulate all the amount possible. So we actually think there's a route for some other forms of finance government could come in. And if you look back at previous examples of scaling technologies like offshore wind, there are often innovative financial instruments that were done just to help those kind of first projects through. It's also important to say money is not the only thing government can provide, and the wider regulatory environment is key here. And we've had legal experts, particularly at Edinburgh, map out the regulatory environment for all of these removal methods, which has been absolutely fascinating. And you find that there are a bunch of regulations which touch on these projects that often projects aren't initially, or entrepreneurs aren't aware of, and often there are regulators who aren't entirely aware of the innovation in this space. And one example is waste regulation. This is absolutely key if you're using materials which are defined as waste, which is important for biochar and enhanced rock weathering. And also if you're applying things on land, there are very tight restrictions for very good reasons on that. And we think there's actually scope, that there's a need to tweak waste regulations in order to maintain environmental integrity, but to actually enable some of these removal methods. So we've mapped out the sort of regulatory environment, and that too, I hope, is a really good resource for people. Just thirdly and finally on capacity building, I've got this photo. This is one of the kind of least defined, but it's been one of the most fun and rewarding aspects. We have a bunch of early career researchers we've been able to fund through this program, which has been great. And we wanted to build an early career research network. But we thought, well, why just keep it to our own program members? Why not widen this out to other people who are at an early stage of their career, but they're working in regulation, they're working in consultancies, they're working in startups, they're working in NGOs, all in removal or removal adjacent fields. And our hypothesis was there might be a few more people than we know of, and they might all assume that there are fewer people working on this than there actually are. This Future Leaders Network has now grown to a network of over 200 people, and we've had camps, we've had field sites, we've had online training and seminars. They've been great at organizing themselves, and it's been great to see that. And I think as this sector grows, that's going to be important. A lot of the people we train through research projects like this, sadly, not all of them are going to become professors, but they're going to work in different sectors, and that's going to be important. And we've heard really good testimonies actually from a few of them about how this has really helped them make really definitive choices in their career. We've also been working just on that capability building on models. So Iain mentioned the forestry work they've been doing with DEFRA. We've been working with DesNets on the energy systems model they use called UK Times, amongst other models, to actually get a representation of some of these removal methods in that weren't in before based on demonstrator data. So that's something we've been doing. Final slide from me. I just want to show a snapshot of kind of where we are and maybe where we need to get to, just to kind of overarch set the scene. So we've done these estimates in core. We published a UK state of carbon dioxide removal report, and we've been involved in the global reports you might be aware of as well. Currently, at the moment, we think in terms of projects in the pipeline, if everything comes good in terms of what's going to be involved in the CCUS clusters the government is building, and other projects which have committed to sell carbon removal credits materialize, we'll get to about 2.8 million tonnes, and a lot of that is BECCS, as you can see here. The government's ambition, or at least the previous government's ambition in its net zero plan, was that we want 5 million tonnes. This is specifically new removal technologies, so this is not land sector stuff, but it's new kind of industrial technologies, as well as BECCS, biochar and enhanced rock weathering. 5 million tonnes by 2030, and then that 36 is what the Climate Change Committee thinks we need to get to net zero. And it's important to say we didn't have this data at the start of the programme. So actually keeping track of these estimates is something that's been a new development, as well as the government's announcement of 5 million tonnes. But also with these demonstration projects, we're working with them to actually trial these things and see to what extent they really do work. So we've come a long way in the last 5 years. We've still got a long way to go. Thank you.
The last of our 6 leads is going to join us virtually. Yes, hooray! This is Professor David Beerling, who's the PI of the Enhanced Rock Weathering Demonstrator from the University of Sheffield. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I can't, can you hear me okay? I'm sorry I can't be there. I remember Tyndall only dimly when I shared an office with him. I'd particularly like to see his ratio spectrophotometer in action. Anyway, I'm tasked with giving you a kind of edited set of highlights over 10 minutes of the Enhanced Rock Weathering Demonstrator. And so I'm going to crack on. Your first question might be, what is Enhanced Rock Weathering? And so this is a very simple schematic that illustrates how it works. So here's a field of crops, and the idea is you apply crushed silicates, possibly something like basalt, and then as it rains, it produces the CO2 dissolves with water to form carbonic acid, and then around the rooting zones, the corrosive nature of the soil and the microbes breaks the rocks down. This is a very simple representation of silicates, which you'll see again later on. Here's our calcium silicate, CO2 and water, and it releases cations, in this case calcium, which are charge balanced by the formation of bicarbonate. And then over time, it passes through groundwater and streams into the oceans, where it's stored on a lifetime of 10 to 100,000 years. And 3 advantages of this, 3 of the key sort of elements of this. The first is it harnesses natural reactions that have been regulating Earth's climate for millions of years. It's also because you can apply the rock dust with existing equipment and farmlands are heavily managed, it's deployable within a decade or 2 at scale for CDR. It's also co-deployable with some of the other management proposals, CDR removal strategies that you've been hearing about this morning. So, for example, you could co-deploy with afforestation projects, and this is actually being trialled by the carbon community in Wales. You could co-deploy with bioenergy crops, and we're working on that with folks from the University of Illinois. And you could also co-deploy with biochar. So, you know, in the sort of lingo that you heard this morning, this has got great potential for stacking with other CDR techs. So the way we organized our demonstrator was 4 work packages. The first one was trying to understand how it might operate across 4 major land uses in the UK. So arable land, lowland grazing and upland grazing. And then we have a public engagement, responsible research and innovation package, which is led by Nick Pigeon and Karen Hemwood, trying to understand particularly the importance of local communities and how they feel about enhanced weathering and how they view its acceptability. Then the work package 3 was thinking about sustainability. What basalt resources have we got? What silicate rock resources have we got to do this? How could we scale them up? How sustainable is it? What are the environmental impacts? And then the fourth work package was really about trying to understand the interaction between the weathered products as they drain out of the soil and into groundwaters, rivers, and the oceans, how that affects the carbon dioxide removal efficiency. So I'm just going to give you one or two highlights from these 4 work packages. So this is a set of data from the arable field trial where we applied rock annually for 3 times, and it seems to have screwed the numbering up. Essentially, you've got 3 rock dust applications here, and this is soil pH in the surface soil, 0 to 23 centimeters on the left, and the pH of those plots that have received basalt are in blue, and you can see the pH is above the orange line, which is the treated line. And this is a primary metric of weathering. So as rock weathering occurs, it produces alkalinity, and that increases pH. And that's one of the benefits of enhanced weathering. All of our agricultural soils are heavily acidified due to nitrogen fertilizers, generally. And as a consequence of that, farmers need to apply limestone. Whereas what we're showing is actually you can apply a crushed rock like basalt and get a pH increase. And you see it in the surface soil, and then the panel on the right there shows you further down, you can see that the pH increase is attenuated. And actually, if you do the maths, you can show that the pH increase that we observe is equivalent to applying 4 tons per hectare of ground limestone. Now, how do we figure out carbon dioxide removal from these trials? Here's our equation again. So on the top here, you can see here's our very simplified representation of silicates, it's calcium silicate. It combines with carbon dioxide and water, and you can see it releases calcium, produces bicarbonate, that's carbon capture, and silicic acid. Now you can see that this offers 2 opportunities to calculate carbon dioxide removal. You can either calculate it by measuring the loss of cations from your feedstock, from your basalt that you've mixed in with the soil. And then you know that has to be ultimately that has to be charge balanced by the formation of bicarbonate. So that's the formation, that's actually carbon capture. So you can measure that, and that's the time integrated carbon dioxide removal loss. Or you can do a second term where you actually directly measure this bicarbonate formation using lysimeters, which are essentially soil tubes that go down about 80 to 100 centimeters and sample the soil water. And on all 3 of our field trials, we can measure both of these. But what I want to do is just show you what the carbon dioxide removal potential curve looks like with the 3 sites based on cation loss. So we have Harpenden on the left here, which is our arable trial. Then we have Northwick, which is our lowland grazing site, and Plinlimmon, which is our upland grazing site. And this is cumulative rates of carbon dioxide removal based on the amount of basalt that's dissolved after annual applications. And if you look at Northwick, which is the green squares here, you can see that it increases over time. And then if you look at, this is 40 tons per hectare. And if you look at Plinlimmon, which is the upland grassland site where we did half the application rate, you've got a reduced rate of cumulative CDR, but the CDR carbon dioxide removal rate goes up. And the Harpenden trial with arable is ongoing. But again, very encouraging results in terms of thinking about carbon dioxide removal rates as a consequence of the rock dust treatments. And we can use this sort of information to try and figure out what the maximum rate of carbon dioxide removal might be with enhanced weathering. And so if you think about an average rate of CDR of about 8 tons per hectare from that arable site, and you multiply it by the total amount of arable land, then you get 48 million tons of CO2 removal. But of course, there's a penalty, a mining, grinding, transportation penalty of about 20%. So you end up with a very broad, approximate carbon dioxide removal rate of about 38 million tons. This is an absolute maximum rate. Okay, I want to make that point. That's maximum rate. And then you can do the same thing with the pasture. You know the annual sea carbon dioxide removal rate, you know the area. So you can get a gross number, and then you subtract, or you convert it into net by subtracting the emissions. So this gives us a maximum rate for either grassland or arable of somewhere between 38 and 24 million tons of CO2 removal. Now, you're never going to get that because we're never going to deploy enhanced weathering across all of the croplands or all of the arable land in the UK. But it's an interesting metric to know what the upper limit is of this technology. And we can also use it to try and validate modeling. So we did quite a lot of modeling on trying to understand what the CDR rates would be if you applied rock dust to croplands. And the model said somewhere between 6 and 30 million tons a year. And if you upscale our field trials, then it's somewhere between 24 and 38. So the models are not a million miles off. We're in the right ballpark. Now, the UK's greenhouse gas removal requirement is about somewhere between maybe 50 and 60 million tons of CO2 per year by 2050. So you can see that even if we had a fraction of what the field trials are offering, then it could make a significant dent in our requirement to deliver CDR. Now, I just want to highlight some innovation that was done by our public engagement team. They're particularly interested in understanding the importance of the acceptability of deployment to local communities. And to do this, they built a scale model, which you can see in the middle here, showing all the different key elements of a deployment. So you have farms, you have quarries, and they asked them, how would you feel about increased transportation, or if you were putting rock dust on this field, or if you had a quarry over here? And it's a very innovative way to think about how implementation of this technology might affect local communities. And some of the key things that emerged from this was they wanted plans in place for remediation. They wanted to know whether or not monitoring, reporting, and verification of carbon dioxide removal works. Is it worth all the effort? And they wanted fair governance systems. And there's a lot more detail to this. And if you want to hear more about it, Nick and Karen have already published a paper on it. It's on the right-hand side there. If you scan that QR code, it will take you to the published paper. Okay, 4 conclusions from our demonstrator so far. First is that we're seeing evidence from arable lands and grasslands that if you apply rock dust, you're capturing carbon. And we see that in the water signals and also in the solid soils. We're seeing improved soil health without any adverse effects of trace metals on the soils or the crops. The rates of carbon dioxide we're seeing in terms of based on dissolution of the feedstock are consistent with process modeling and support enhanced weathering as a contributor to getting the UK to net zero by 2050. Our public engagement team have shown that actually stakeholder and local communities are generally optimistic about this, but they want to see longer term scientific trials to reduce uncertainties and improve confidence in the technology. Obviously, we support that. And finally, our sustainability work package, which I haven't had time to talk about, shows there's considerable scope for scalability in terms of exploiting the UK's basalt resources. And when you look at the life cycle assessment impacts on the environment and human health, it turns out to be low relative to some of the other CDR techs and also relative to other countries that might want to employ enhanced weathering. Okay, thanks. I'll stop there.
Brilliant. Thank you, David. Okay, so because everybody has so many things that they are enthusiastic about, we're running a little bit over. So the tea break is supposed to start at 12:30. We're going to make that 11:40. So you're going to have to wait an extra 10 minutes for your tea. But to fill that space, we have lots to talk about. So please, could the 5 leads who are in the room come down to join me here? And David is still with us online. If you see him wave at the camera because he needs to say something and you think I've missed it, do let me know. Okay, so. And just to remind you, obviously you've got probably minds buzzing full of lots of stuff. If you have questions or comments or critiques or any of that, please do get out the CVent app, go to Plenary 1, scroll all the way down to the bottom. There is a Q&A thing there. So do please be putting your questions and comments in there from now onwards for the rest of the day, and we'll get to those at the end of the day. Okay, right. So you all look like you're on trial here, I have to say. So we were sort of getting to some of those bits at the end there about the numbers. Steve, you showed the gap between current ambitions and the overall current plans and the overall ambitions, and we got some numbers at the end there from David. How much could these different techniques, I mean, in practice, there's a theoretical maximum, yes, fine, that's nice to know, but just as your best guess, like how much of the way to our removal ambitions could these various techniques take us? Very briefly, like what's the kind of big picture? Let's go down the line very quickly because this is kind of a quick answer. Iain, go on.
We can we can do it all. Yeah,
you can do it all.
Yeah,
that's very confident.
Not through one technology, by the way. I do think it is a combination of them, but and actually we can do it in a fairly cost-effective way if we want to.
And is that anybody else got comments on that? Is that more or less where all of you have got to with this?
Yeah, I mean, but there are really important systemic effects between the two. So I'd say 3 real key finite resources are land, biomass, and energy. Some of these methods actually generate energy. Some of them require energy to take. Some of them might potentially compete for biomass feedstocks, although it might be that some actually really work well for some biomass that can't be used by another. And of course, the UK is not the largest country in the world, and we do quite a lot of stuff with land, so there's a lot of pressure. So there are issues which mean that you can't just add all of these together, and you need to think about it systemically. But yeah, there's enough in principle to go around.
I think that. I mean, I think the challenge is how do you balance the competing demand. So I think although the GGRs can work together, reconciling that with food production and all the other uses of the land is a challenge. And I think, Cumbria is not that small an area, is it? So, and then you expand that to, all the other areas that might be relevant to this. And although some of these things can happen in combination with agriculture, I think it needs thinking through so that there aren't.
Colin, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I think just to add another dimension with Biochar, this will come up this afternoon in the session on regulations, but if Biochar doesn't meet the standard to be applied to land, we get 200 million tonnes of aggregate out the ground every year. So you can imagine if you could just substitute 1% biomass into construction materials into what is on the road, that would represent a huge potential resource.
So there's a lot of scope for doing these things in slightly innovative ways that are just emerging.
Yeah.
Okay, go on, Iain.
So I was going to say, I mean, there's a huge, in a sense, we need to be doing all of it. We also don't want to be putting all our eggs in one basket. So in the sense that the technologies are integratable. And I think also we're seeing is, in a sense, particularly, I guess, as we're seeing with some of the work in the flooded areas, in terms of with peatland restoration, but also some of the more challenging agricultural lands, some of these technologies are providing options where other agricultural systems are maybe struggling with the impacts of climate change already.
Okay, so you've been through, you've been doing this for 4 years now, 5 years, whatever it is, and there must be things that you learned that you didn't think you were going to learn. What surprised you? That's what I want to know. What came out of this that either you weren't expecting or you weren't looking for, or it was just a reaction? There's a sort of technical scientific results, but where were the moments where you went, oh, I didn't think it was going to be like that. No one said that to me before. What are the things that came out of it that were just made you think or picked you up there, Iain?
I think we've all alluded to different, it's actually the way you can combine these technologies.
Yeah.
So in terms of the way you can stack them, but also even with things like biomass and afforestation, you can't do that on the same land, but you can combine them as a system and actually deliver those longer term ambitions with some technologies coming in earlier, others coming in later. So it's the way you bring the technologies together, I think, is certainly something I definitely learned.
I don't know if your microphone has been bent out deliberately or whether you've done that accidentally, but it maybe just bend it in a tiny bit, because then we might be able to hear you. So, anybody else got what other surprising or unusual? Yeah, Iain.
The amazing, and this has actually happened during the space of the project, the amazing advances that AI actually can give us in the ability to combine models together, the speed enhancement, which is just phenomenal. And if you'd have asked me 5 years ago, I'd have said, yeah, we're going to try it. I have no idea if it's going to work. It works. And the ability, because of that speed, to get someone who is a real-world decision maker to make decisions which 5 years ago, there was nobody in the world that could do this, because you needed experts in every single element. There was nobody in the world that was an expert in everything. And even in this 5-year period, we've moved to a situation where an intelligent, real-world decision maker, not some sort of super being, can actually combine all this information.
So it's making the collected knowledge accessible to what's going on. David, you're there online. I can see you've got your hand up. Sorry, I missed that before. What surprised or shocked maybe you as you were going through it all?
A couple of things, actually, just to go back to your earlier point. I think the UK does need to think seriously about food security, about agricultural soil health, and about, particularly with the events in Ukraine, becoming more independent in terms of its fertilizers, its potassium and phosphorus fertilizers. And, enhanced weathering can deliver that. But if it's going to scale in a way that's really going to benefit the agricultural community, we do need the UK government to get behind it and deliver policies to stimulate deployment at scale. That was the first thing. In terms of two surprises, one is worms love basalt. So it turns out that but all of our sites, actually, we've seen like a 10-fold increase in earthworms in the surface of the soil, which is pretty amazing. Intensive farming does tend to deplete earthworm populations, which are crucially important in ecosystem services, as Darwin recognized in the 1800s. And so to restore that is a really good thing. And the second thing comes from our public engagement work. People tend to think the public view mining as a negative thing, but actually, when you do public engagement work in villages that are sited near mines, you find, particularly, I'm thinking about communities in Shropshire. Our team found that actually the locals quite liked having a mining community, because it provided employment, and the local mine supported the football team and the schools, and they were very used to having that integrated within their society. So the idea that more mining is potentially a negative impact on local communities is not necessarily upheld when you actually get boots on the ground.
Yes, go
on. So I think two surprises that weren't either of them all that surprising, but I think the first, it was quite, the first was a nice surprise, which was how open a lot of the landowners and farmers we work with were to try new things. They're not going to bankrupt themselves, they're not mad, but they're up for trying new things. They're not sort of opposed to any change. And I think sometimes the farming landowner community is presented as being extremely conservative, but I think if you can offer them something that works and which will pay for itself, they're open to that, which is encouraging. I think the less enjoyable, but not that surprising surprise, was just the sheer number of regulatory hurdles we're up against. We're trying to do some of these things.
So give some examples of a regulatory hurdle.
So from the peatland perspective, we've got, so government wants to raise water levels in order to do all these things and mitigate the emissions we've already got, 60 megatons. When you actually try to do that in practice, you're up against water abstraction licenses, restrictions on taking water at certain times of year, which is when you need it. You've got limits on putting biochar onto land, water voles, eels, archaeology. It's a long list. I'm sure I've missed a bunch there.
The eels and the archaeologists are against you, is that what you're saying?
There's a lot of challenges to overcome if you want to manage the land differently, and the system is quite conservative for very good reasons, that we don't want to chuck toxins all over the land to fix climate change and then discover that was not such a smart thing to do. But there's a lot of barriers to work through.
Briefly, Colin, if you would.
Yeah, so I'm a huge fan of social scientists, even though I'm a physical scientist myself. And it's been absolutely incredible response we've had from the farming community. But I think this is not our demonstrators, across all demonstrators, is you really got to think ahead as to what might trip you up. And, there's been so many examples in the past. And,
so you're talking about
fracking is the obvious.
In dealing with local communities?
Yeah, in terms of what might turn local communities against you, because, as we know, once one community is against you, as with fracking, it was like snowball effect throughout the whole of the country.
So you need to do your groundwork beforehand. And listen, do your listening beforehand as well.
Listen very carefully.
So what about just, I mean, we don't have time to cover the huge range of questions that all of this arises, and of course a lot of it will come up later in the day. But just in terms of what do you see as, I mean, I want to talk about timing. How long might some of these things take to work, and how quickly could they get going? What might this look like in 10 years' time? So the question of time, because obviously, you know, we are ticking along quite quickly towards 2035 and 2050, the dates whether these targets have been set. How does the timing of this work? Can this be done quickly? Should it be done quickly? What are the obstacles to that timing? Who's going to go? Yes, Iain.
So I think there's another bit I'd like to put in there, really, I think, is with the timing, is that we almost need to set some intermediate targets. So I'd say with, let's say, the perennial biomass crops, we have about 10,000 hectares in the UK. I'd say, right, let's set a target of 100,000, not the 700,000. Let's set 100,000, and actually let's work to delivering that. Once you've got that target in place, the industries will then know, right, okay, how many bits of machinery, you know, how many plants are we gearing up for? And actually, it's the learning by doing that as well. And so some of the concerns that we might have about impacts and so on, well, actually, let's do this, and actually we can be reviewing it. Let's get to 100,000, review how we've done. You know, is that going well? Should we go to the next stage, or do we need to refine?
So achievable targets in the
Absolutely.
short term. Yeah, timing, yeah, Iain.
Timing's probably almost the most important factor in forestry. It's at least as important anyway as location. And in a way, it's very, very simple. If you plant a tree now, it will start off very, very slow. And we know this, put a sapling in, come back a year later, and you can hardly tell the difference. Once many of these trees get into their young maturity, they start storing carbon very, very fast. But those two things together means that starting now means that forestry can make a big contribution to the 2050 goal. You plant a tree in 2049, it will have no effect on that. Taking a simple rule that says we're going to plant the same amount every year will be disastrous for some natural systems like forestry, where if you want to hit that target, you've got to really start now.
David, do you have any comments on timing? Oh.
Sure, yeah, I think there's three things to think about here. One is we need an evidence base of efficacy and safety for these technologies. There's no point rushing to roll them out if you don't know they work and if they're not safe. And the second thing is the principal constraint on deployment is financing. How are we going to finance, if you show that it works and it's safe, how are you going to finance upscaling?
Okay, any final comments on timing or achievability? Yes, Colin.
I think it's extraordinarily challenging. I think the time we have left, and you know, as I said about regulations, but we've got a whole kind of fixed land use system. You know, it is the way it is, and it's structured to work in the way that it does. And so to modify that in a substantial way in the time we've got before 2050, and with all the regulatory hurdles and policy decisions and financing and just things like capacity to do stuff, I think I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but it's going to be quite a challenge, I think. And if you go too fast, then you lose people along the way.
So it sounds like, you know, just from our discussion here, that it feels like there's definite potential here to meet goals and to do things, but it's always that trade-off between doing it properly and doing it quickly, yeah. And that's the bit to navigate. I don't want to keep people from their tea break, so we are going to, if you've got a very quick point, Colin.
Yeah, I think really what is missing, and we see this for, shall we say, larger, more established technologies, you know, particularly CCS, is a roadmap. And I think in a UK context, that would be great, which would integrate all the GGR approaches.
Integration is absolutely vital.
Okay, well, that is a great place to finish. So if you've got your own questions and comments, do put them into the app. As far as the tea break thing goes, there's tea everywhere out there. There's tea up here, there's tea down there. Go find some tea. On your way around, do go and have a look at the exhibits. They're on both the ground and the first floor. There's a film, there's some bioluminescent algae in the demonstration room along there, so that sounds fun. Some VR, a biochar sculpture, an animator and a filmmaker to talk to in the library. Loads of things, but the important thing is there's information about all of that in the app. Be back here at 12 for the next session. And before you go, please join me in thanking our 6 fabulous contributors to start us off today.